We are 52 days away from the presidential election as you take a live look right there over the White House in D.C. Now, federal investigators say they're doing everything they can to protect the integrity of that election. The DOJ preparing criminal charges in connection with an Iranian hack that targeted Donald Trump's presidential campaign. The Associated Press reporting via sources that the charges are the result of an FBI investigation into an intrusion that multiple agencies quickly linked to an Iranian effort to influence American politics. The Trump campaign said last month that it was hacked by Iranian actors who stole sensitive internal documents. Those confidential materials were then sent to news outlets that included Politico, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. But the outlets did refuse to reveal any details about what it received from the hackers. The Justice Department has been raising alarms about aggressive efforts by countries like Iran and Russia to meddle in the U.S. presidential election through hacking and covert social media campaigns that are designed to shape public opinion. The attempted breach of the Biden-Harris campaign earlier in the year was also linked to Iran by those federal investigators. So much to talk about here, so I do want to bring in a friend of the show, Mark Chandler, Director of Government Relations and Professor of Practice at Coastal Carolina University, also a former senior defense intelligence official. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us, as always.
You're welcome, Josh, and good morning to you.
Good morning. Well, first off, I do want to talk about the overall information that came in, that this was all linked to Iran, and the charges are going to be filed there by the DOJ. First off, though, is it surprising at all that Iran would be linked to something like this?
Well, the short answer to the surprising question, Josh, is no. So if I can elaborate a little bit about looking back in time over Iran's cyber capabilities. You know, when I was at one of my key positions in DOD intelligence, a little over a decade ago, we watched Iran really expand its cyber capabilities. About 12 years ago, and it lasted for about 2 years, they had a significant, what I would call brute force cyber capability, a lot of distributed denial of service attacks against the U.S. financial infrastructure, U.S. corporations, and the U.S. government. And this lasted for some time as they continued to build that. On top of that brute force attack, it's in the news now, but there was a significant attack against Saudi Aramco, the oil company in Saudi Arabia. During that attack, Iran used something called the Shamoon virus. And in that, they destroyed 35,000 computers in about 4 hours' time. And it set back the distribution network for the oil, and it also costs Aramco millions of dollars. So Iran has a very viable cyber capability that people don't talk about a lot. So this is not surprising, and it's something that will continue.
How exactly is the U.S. government able to so quickly say, look, this is Iran that is behind this? Because it was very definitive. They said that Iran is behind not only the Trump campaign hacking, but also the Biden-Harris one from earlier this year, possibly other ones as well.
Well, that's the difficult part of any cyber operation. So it's very difficult to narrow down who an attacker is or who's conducting the cyber attack, because many times these cyber actors use what we call cutouts. And so it may look like the attacks coming from a country in Europe, from another organization. So they really use these cutouts. But what we start to see in following these attacks is you start to see some cyber fingerprints start to develop, if you will. These hackers use some of the code that they've developed that's reliable, that they're familiar with. And if they continue to do that, then they're going to leave behind some traces. And our excellent cyber defense capabilities that we have in DOD and in some in DISA under DHS, they're going to be able to kind of start to trace that back. And so what we see in related to some charges that actually DOJ passed about April of this year against some folks who were attacking thousands of American citizens, but also some corporations, you start to see this trace back. And this particular one that we're discussing today actually came about 6 months ago. And so when you look at that, the time frame, This one did take months. It could take months or years before we find a true culprit in one of these type attacks. But the continuation of what Iran does helped discover this one to allow DOJ now to bring these charges.
And speaking specifically about the charges, what charges can the DOJ actually bring against these hackers? And do they have to be located in the U.S. for those charges to even matter?
Well, first off, they don't have to be located in the U.S. I mean, we're all the time sanctioning a foreign entity, foreign individuals, or we're bringing charges. If I go back into that charge I mentioned back in April, DOJ filed several charges against 2 Iranian individuals. And those primary charges were computer hacking, wire fraud. That's a very common DOJ interstate wire fraud, computer used for wire fraud, and computer destruction, or using the computers to destroy individual information or attack an individual. So those are kind of generic charges, easy to kind of build up your case for. But when I'm trying to file those against a foreign entity or a foreign individual, that's going to be very difficult. So I would see the charges come out in something along those lines, similar to what the DOJ did in April against the individuals or whatever organization inside Iran that we're going to trace this back to and formally charge.
Would you say that these charges possibly are more symbolic than anything?
Well, unfortunately, I think that's a good question and good point to make, Josh. Yeah, they really are symbolic. It's not as if the United States is going to go in and grab these individuals out of Iran, and definitely Iran is not going to turn them over, since this is a state-sponsored attack on our system. And so they're not going to do it. Those charges we filed in April, nothing has been done to the 2 Iranian citizens out there. And I highly doubt any of the Iranians involved in this activity are going to travel to a country where we have an extradition treaty. So it sounds good. It's symbolic. Maybe it generates a little bit of confidence that we know what's happening to our election system or some of our computer networks out here, but nothing's really going to come of this other than the symbology that you're bringing up.
Yeah, and talking a little bit more here about the situation overall, we know, as we mentioned there, that it is pretty much symbolic. But the question that so many people have is, what sort of impact could these hackers, the leakers, what could they really do to the U.S. election?
Well, that we cannot underestimate, Josh, and that's a great question, because what we have to look at is they could come in very maliciously and actually destroy data. If they gain access to some of the critical infrastructure and networks, let's say some of our election networks that are actually coordinated with the states, because remember, the states are responsible for their individual election processes, and then interfering at the federal level. So they could actually go in and try to destroy data in some sort of open network. And they're going to continue this. But they can also create a false narrative. And when we have artificial intelligence that's really running crazy in today's social network environment, they could create false narratives. That could then gain traction. So it could look like something's coming from either of these campaigns or supporters of the campaigns, not be true, but be dropped at such a critical point or time in the election process that there is no time to validate or verify that information. And that's going to create its own situation of false narrative, misinformation, or disinformation out there. That's where the damaging effects could occur, other than just physical destruction of data.
This is nothing new, right? We've seen situations like this happen over previous election cycles and really just throughout time.
Yes, we have, Josh, and it's gotten worse over time. I can go back to the 2016 election, and there was a group called Fancy Bear. This is a Russian hacking group that has direct ties to the GRU. That is Russian military intelligence. And so they interfered in the 2016 election by hacking into and stealing data from the Democratic National Committee. And so that was some Hillary Clinton data that they absolutely didn't want released, but Fancy Bear was able to go in and do that. And then when we moved forward to 2020, we saw China really start to jump into the fray. So Fancy Bear continued its attacks. They changed their name a little bit. They come up with different monikers for the hacking groups that come in. But then you see the group Zirconium come out of China, and they started to interfere in the elections and up their game in 2020. Iran got into the act also in 2020. So this election interference this year is not new for Iran. So you've got three primary actors who are, striking out, if you will, against the United States election process and information flow.
Is there any way to know who is the biggest threat to the U.S. here when we talk about the integrity of the election? Would it be Iran, Russia, China? Do we know, or are they all kind of on equal playing fields?
Well, you hit the big three, and I'm going to say those are the big three primary. If I were to put them in some sort of hierarchical ranking, I'm going to go with Russia, China, and Iran in that order because of their historic efforts to do this, but also in their ability. I talked about Fancy Bear, I talked about Zirconium from China, but we have to realize that there is a concerted effort. I don't think right now, and obviously I don't have access to the intelligence anymore, that they are all three working together. But that doesn't make them any less dangerous because all three are going to push attacks into the election process and attacks, and this is very concerning, attacks on our confidence in our information flow in the United States. Social media has really taken over, and the data that flows through that and whether or not we're going to validate or verify the sources, that really can lead to a lot of misinformation and disinformation. And the critical thing is a lack of confidence by Americans in the information they're getting and in the security of our election process. And I think that's really what all three of those want to do. They want to destabilize our electoral and political process. In the current environment, political environment we're in, that's not hard to do. And so that they're going to continue to work. They are working to completely destabilize our information flow in the U.S.
You kind of already touched on this, but my last question for you, why is it so important that the American people and all American people are aware that this is going on and this has the potential to influence the election?
Well, I think awareness is critical for the American public. I mean, when we look at things, aware that Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, we can't forget the North Koreans are out there trying to do harm to our information flow. I refer back to my analytic training. And so when I go to sources or I look at sources, it's validate before I trust. And I think we as American citizens need to understand that. As I mentioned, the speed of information flow in today's society with social media, and now I can amplify that with artificial intelligence, we need to be acutely aware of the sources and the information that's coming from there. I mean, some of your peers in the media, Josh, they don't necessarily do a great job of validating the sources before they start to put things out there. I appreciate the fact that the New York Post and Politico kind of held back on releasing the information that this Iranian hacker group had, but we don't see that every day. And there are no checks and balances on social media. So it's on us, the viewer, the readers, to step up our game, if you will, and trust that. There's an old saying, in the marketing and in shopping, buyer beware. And now I have to say, reader and viewer beware when you start to click or you start to open some sort of phishing attempt against you or some sort of exploitation media going against you. We have to be aware that there are people wanting to destabilize our political process. And that's something that is a direct threat and will be for the next few months until the election and then after that.
A lot of great and important information there. Mark Chandler, as always, thank you so much for taking the time to be here. Anything else you want to add about any of this before I let you go?
Well, no, Josh, I think your last question really drives the point home about Americans' situational and what I would say information awareness. That's something that we can actually take control of. If we take our individual responsibilities and validate that information, we can actually stop this interference, not stop the attempts, but we can then take control of our political processes and ensure that we're looking at the right information and we're making decisions based on facts versus speculation or some foreign influence on our elections. I think it's critical, and I'm really glad you brought this topic up today.
All right, Mark Chandler, again, thank you so much for spending part of your day with us. As always, we appreciate it.
You're welcome, Josh. My pleasure.